If you want to understand how a single decision can bend history, redraw borders, shatter lives, and quietly unravel the power of a man who once seemed untouchable, stay with me. Because what you are about to hear is not the story most headlines told you, not a list of battles or dates, but a slow-burning reveal of how Vladimir Putin, the former KGB officer who built his image on control, patience, and cold calculation, walked step by step into a strategic maze in Ukraine that turned his greatest strengths into liabilities. And if you watch until the end, you will see how these mistakes reshaped Europe, exposed the limits of modern authoritarian power, and may define Russia's future for generations. So before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and stay with this channel, because this story does not end where you think it does. And once you see the pattern, you will never look at global power the same way again. The promise of this documentary is simple but unsettling: that the war in Ukraine was not just a clash of armies, but a collision between assumptions and reality, between myth and modern warfare. And the emotional grip begins long before tanks crossed borders, back in the quiet years, when Putin convinced himself that Ukraine was not truly a country, but a historical mistake, a belief rooted in imperial memory and personal identity, that became the first and most dangerous strategic error. Because when a leader refuses to see a neighbor as sovereign, every decision that follows is built on sand. And this mindset shaped Moscow's actions from the start, from underestimating Ukrainian nationalism to assuming that Russian language and shared history would outweigh decades of independence, corruption scandals, and civic struggle that forged a new Ukrainian identity, one that hardened after the 2014 Maidan Revolution, when Ukrainians showed they were willing to die for a European future, a moment Putin interpreted not as a genuine popular uprising, but as a Western-backed coup, reinforcing his conviction that Ukraine was merely a battlefield for foreign influence, rather than a nation with its own will. And this misreading of motivation was fatal, because strategy begins with understanding your opponent, and Putin never truly tried to understand Ukraine as it was, only as he needed it to be, for his worldview to hold. And so when Russian planners imagined a rapid campaign in 2022, they envisioned columns welcomed by passive citizens, elites switching sides overnight, and a government collapsing in days, an assumption that ignored years of polling, protests, and political change, that showed a society increasingly united against Russian domination. And here lies the second major mistake: the belief that speed and shock alone could substitute for legitimacy. Because modern wars are not won only by taking territory, but by holding it, administering it, and convincing people to accept a new reality. And Russia's plan prioritized theatrical momentum over sustainable control, sending lightly supplied units deep into hostile territory, stretching logistics thin, and betting everything on a psychological collapse that never came. And when Ukrainian resistance stiffened instead of crumbled, those long convoys became symbols not of power, but of vulnerability, broadcast across social media in real time, feeding a narrative of Russian weakness that would haunt Moscow throughout the conflict. And this brings us to another critical miscalculation: the underestimation of information warfare in the digital age. Because Putin's Russia mastered television propaganda at home, but struggled in an environment where every soldier carried a camera and every civilian could tell their story to the world. And as images of bombed cities, displaced families, and defiant Ukrainian leaders spread across American and European screens, public opinion hardened in ways that made compromise politically impossible. For Western governments, turning what Putin expected to be a localized operation into a moral drama, framed as democracy versus authoritarianism. And by failing to control the narrative beyond Russia's borders, the Kremlin inadvertently unified an alliance it had spent years trying to fracture, revitalizing NATO, accelerating defense spending, and pushing historically neutral countries to reconsider their security posture. A strategic irony so sharp, it almost feels scripted, because one of Putin's stated goals had long been to weaken NATO's relevance. Yet the invasion of Ukraine gave the alliance a new purpose, a clear enemy, and renewed public support, especially in the United States, where policymakers could point to Ukraine as proof that hard power still mattered, and that American leadership remained indispensable. And this outcome flowed directly from another mistake: the misreading of Western resolve. Because Putin had watched the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan internal divisions in the US, and political polarization across Europe, and he concluded that the West was too tired, too fractured, and too self-interested to respond forcefully, and for a moment, this assumption seemed reasonable, but he failed to account for the emotional trigger that Ukraine represented a large-scale invasion of a European democracy in the 21st century, which crossed a psychological red line, especially for countries with historical memories of invasion, and so, sanctions that were supposed to be symbolic became severe, targeting Russia's central bank, cutting off access to technology, and slowly strangling sectors of the economy that depended on global integration. And while Russia adapted better than some predicted, the long-term damage was undeniable, pushing Moscow into deeper dependence on China, shrinking its technological base, and narrowing its strategic options, all of which stemmed from another flawed assumption that economic pain could be absorbed indefinitely without political consequences, an idea rooted in Russia's history of hardship, but dangerously outdated in a globalized economy where consumer expectations, elite interests, and generational change matter more than raw endurance. And as the war dragged on, the Kremlin faced a dilemma of its own making, because admitting failure was unthinkable, escalation was risky, and compromise looked like defeat, trapping Putin in a narrowing corridor of choices, each more costly than the last. And this strategic rigidity was compounded by the structure of power around him, where loyalty often mattered more than competence, and bad news traveled slowly upward, if at all, leading to overconfidence at the top and confusion on the ground, as units received unclear objectives, shifting priorities, and unrealistic timelines, a classic problem in authoritarian systems where fear distorts feedback, and when mistakes happened, they were often blamed on individuals rather than strategy, preventing meaningful course correction. And this inability to adapt quickly became another critical weakness, because Ukraine, supported by Western intelligence and weapons, adapted fast, experimenting, learning, and exploiting Russian patterns, turning the battlefield into a test of flexibility versus rigidity. And time and again, it was the side willing to adjust that gained the advantage, while Russia's reliance on mass and attrition clashed. With a global media environment that magnified civilian suffering and reinforced international support for Kyiv, deepening Putin's isolation and making each passing month more politically expensive. And perhaps the most profound mistake of all was the misjudgment of Ukrainian leadership, because Putin seemed to believe that President Volodymyr Zelensky, a former comedian, would flee or fold under pressure. Yet Zelensky stayed, spoke directly to his people and the world, and became a symbol of resistance that galvanized aid and attention. And this personal miscalculation had strategic consequences, because leadership matters in war, not just in issuing orders, but in shaping morale, legitimacy, and narrative. And Zelensky's visibility contrasted sharply with Putin's distance, reinforcing the image of Ukraine as a nation fighting for survival and Russia as an aggressor, led by a man increasingly detached from reality. And this contrast resonated deeply with American audiences raised on stories of underdogs' freedom and defiance, making support for Ukraine not just a policy choice, but a moral stance. And as weapons flowed in, from anti-tank missiles to advanced artillery and intelligence sharing, Russia faced a technologically enabled opponent far more capable than anticipated, exposing another strategic blind spot: the assumption that escalation dominance would deter deep Western involvement, when in fact the gradual, calibrated increase in aid allowed the US and its allies to support Ukraine without crossing thresholds that might trigger direct conflict, turning Putin's nuclear signaling into background noise rather than decisive leverage. And as months turned into years, the war settled into a grinding struggle that eroded Russia's military readiness, depleted experienced units, and forced reliance on mobilization measures that carried domestic political risks, further illustrating how a short war fantasy became a long war reality. And through it all, Putin's initial framing of the invasion as a limited operation constrained his ability to mobilize society fully, creating a disconnect between rhetoric and reality that undermined trust and fueled quiet dissent, especially among families directly affected. And this tension between control and truth, between image and substance, lies at the heart of the strategic failure, because power built on illusion eventually collides with facts. And Ukraine became that collision point, a place where historical grievances met modern resistance, and where a leader who believed he could bend time backward discovered that history does not move in reverse. And for American viewers, this story carries a deeper lesson, not just about Russia or Ukraine, but about the nature of power itself, about how overconfidence, misreading of human motivation, and contempt for agency can undo even the most carefully constructed systems. And as you watch this unfold, notice the rhythm of miscalculation and consequence, how each assumption created conditions for the next mistake, how speed replaced strategy, how narrative was ignored until it was too late, how alliances were underestimated, and how identity was misjudged. And if you're still with me, here's the payoff, because the true strategic cost of these mistakes is not measured only in territory gained or lost, but in the erosion of Russia's long-term position in the world, the narrowing of its economic and diplomatic options, and the precedent set for resistance against authoritarian aggression. A precedent that will echo far beyond Eastern Europe, influencing how future conflicts are perceived and contested. And this is why understanding Putin's biggest strategic mistakes in Ukraine matters, not as an exercise in hindsight, but as a warning that even the most powerful leaders can become prisoners of their own narratives, and that in the modern world, legitimacy, adaptability, and respect for agency are not soft concepts, but hard strategic assets. And as this documentary continues, we will peel back each layer of assumption and consequence, revealing how a war meant to restore greatness instead exposed vulnerability, how a bid for control sparked unity among opponents, and how history, once again, refused to follow the script written for it. So stay with us, because the next chapter of this story is still being written, and the choices made here will shape the world you live in, whether you realize it or not.